Seguimos en el CCCB, seguimos en Sónar+D, para una sesión ahora para hablar probablemente del concepto que puede en estos momentos inquietarnos más. So we're going to talk about a word that floats heavily over all of us, and that word, of course, is future. And we're going to tell stories about futures and the way that we deal with them, the way we negotiate them, and the way that we learn how to think about them in different ways. Something that caught my attention, and I think that it's easier to understand things when you have a certain perspective, was how this year the Global Risk Report that every year the Davos Forum releases at the beginning of the year, listing what are the 10 biggest threats to global stability in the world, meant something very different now that we know which was the biggest threat to stability in the world in 2020. So for the first time, we could do something that we cannot normally do, which is go back to this document, to this report, and look it up and say, hey, did it say that there was going to be a global pandemic and this was going to be a huge threat, a big danger? And actually, it did say that. The problem is that it did say that at the end of a page, in the middle of the report, in a not really noticeable way, and it was not in the top 10 global risks that it was shaping. And this is a nice, interesting exercise to understand how do we navigate the uncertainty and our limitations to project what is happening in the world, and how is this going to determine the way that society is going to change in the coming future. Probably we have never been so concerned about our short-term and our mid-term future, because we don't really know what the 6 months are going to be like. We don't really know how our life is going to change when we finally have a vaccine that may give us opportunities to change what we're doing now. Probably we have never been in such a moment where the horizon of the 6 months of the year, of the 2 years, has determined more our possibilities of thinking about the rest of our lives. This is why we thought it was very interesting bringing 3 people here that was going to give us 3 lessons in how to think about futures and how to operate with the parameters of understanding projection, understanding foresight, and always measuring how do we contemplate one single set of parameters and try to project from that what should we plan for, how should we act. These are 3 great specialists that have dealt with these topics for a very long time, and I am super happy to have today with us here on stage Scott Smith from Changeist, Elisabet Roselló, and joining us from Madrid, Fabien Girardin. Fabien, can you hear us? He's there on the other side of the screen. Fabien is one of the founding partners of one of the most interesting organizations working in design and futures in the last 10 years, Near Future Laboratory. The Near Future Laboratory has been one of the premier studios working around the space of what we call design fictions. How can we create narrative devices that allow us to project on upcoming scenarios? And he's going to be the protagonist of this first of these 3 lessons on how to think about the future. Thanks for joining us from Madrid, Fabien.
Thank you, Jose Luis. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So let me tell a bit the story, this brief lesson that you wanted us, 3 of us, to tell you about. So first of all, I'm a co-founder and managing partners of Near Future Laboratory. We are a group that is driven by curiosity and doubt. We're based in California and Europe, and we also operate with a wide network of creative associates that is present in different parts of the world. So this session is about discussing the content, the current incredible times and how they are changing our perception of the future. And I think that one observation that all of us can have is that we've seen that there's an acceleration of transformations in some domains like work, education, logistics, and obviously culture, like today, and me having to present remotely and not being on stage today. But this acceleration has been a dynamic before COVID hit, and with a culture coming from Silicon Valley and the tech industry that advocates for an acceleration of innovation. And they use mantras like move fast and break things, disrupt yourself first before someone disrupts the industry. Disruption is creation. And I think that from what the present teaches us is that treating the future is only a problem of business modeling or an engineering problem or a marketing exercise. It's inevitably creates blind spots and unintended consequences. So Over the last 10 years, we've been developing an approach for organizations to pre-visualize risk and consequences before taking actions. And it's not necessarily a methodology with precise steps to follow. We see that more as an attitude to train or a mindset for organizations to kind of constantly reveal the possible, the probable, or the cautionary outcomes of their decisions. And we call it design fictions. And after 10 years, we're about to publish a book about it. So this talk is about sharing some ingredients of that mindset. So at the origin of design fiction is Julian Blicker. And more than 10 years ago, we were in the same research community, along with Nicholas Nova, who is another co-founder of the MIFRE Laboratory. And in that community were present major companies like Intel, Microsoft, Nokia, and they were actually leading the domain called ubiquitous computing. And also investigators who later developed the addictive experiences for Facebook came from that community. So more than 10 years ago, we had proposed a workshop in the major conference of that community about sharing learnings of failed experiments. And out of the 12 workshop proposals, our proposal had been the only one rejected. So for a young researcher like me, it was a signal that the major tech companies were mainly focused on technological solutions and leaving to others kind of the capacity to sort out any consequences of what they do. So for the three of us, and then Nick Foster joined us, it encouraged us to create a near-future laboratory with a practice for envisioning and testing future outcomes of technological concepts. But what does that mean? So let me give you an example of how, for instance, designers who work on the future of domestic life would typically explore that future as the new aesthetics, and they would model the furnitures and accessories that are present in that future. And all this, the most brilliant work of these designers would typically get featured in a design museum in London, like in the catalog that I show here of a recent exhibit on home futures. Our approach is to use a popular object that is accessible to anyone, like an IKEA catalog, to describe these multiple futures. And so we designed a fictional catalog that contains all the specs, the details, and the product that you would expect in a regular IKEA catalog of all the services and interplay with how people use them that might be part of the everyday life of the future. And eventually that catalog was exhibited at the Design Museum. So for us, it became a signal that design fiction is part of the design practice now. And that catalog revealed many implications for each product that it features. And I talk about implications and not predictions because the future is a moving target. And that's why organizations frequently require reorganizations and redirections. And the current time is obviously a strong moment for any organization to actually reshuffle and rethink what is coming. So design fiction is a way to force teams to live with the changing dynamic of this world. So, for instance, we tend to be cultural voyeurs who believe that somebody else's future is somebody else's present. This means that we nurture our curiosity about anything, or as the French writer George Perec would recommend, we question our teaspoons. So in design fiction, seeing the future is a routine. We collect all manner of things like artifacts, social practices, cultural trends, behaviors, new idioms, rituals, and we curate them into a grab bag of reference examples. And these signals become starting points of extrapolations. So for instance, we do live in incredible times, but failure is all around us. So instead of ignoring failures, we report about it. So like the present, the future is kind of a partially broken space. And the future is the place in which the old cohabits and interferes with the brand new. So learning how to see and organize these signals is part of the practice of design fiction. And so it's an attitude to train rather than really a 1, 2, 3 steps to follow. And the idea is that we don't just report about these trends. Because current organizations today, they look at the future, gathering thousands of pages of diagrams, charts, analytics, projections, and they kind of discuss them with PDFs and PowerPoint decks. So that approach brings some clarity about the future, but what we think is that it fails to bring all the pieces of the puzzle together into a whole that is understandable by many. So design fiction is a way to force to actually make things, to pre-visualize what is really possible, what are all the kind of drawbacks and nuances about the future. So if you work in the domain of mobility, for instance, you want to be able to share all the pieces of foresight exercises into an object that people can relate to. And these tangible experiences are more expressive than the PowerPoint presentation because it sticks into people's mind. So, like, for instance, this foldable map of Geneva that reveals a slightly different Geneva from today. It's like an architect like creating a virtual fly-through of a building. At first, it looks like it's real, but it's actually a fiction. And so this map translates for a wide audience kind of a complicated set of data, insights, trends, variables into a single representation. Some part of that representations are threads, some are opportunities, some are blind spots, but all together they reveal like an everyday mundane life of a potential future. Here. So it's kind of, this fiction gathers a collection of micro-futures that actually shows the on-ground implications of trends. For instance, how safety on roads get reshuffled with sensors, AI, personal data, when all that becomes more widely used and utilized in a city. What is the evolution of public transports? What kind of traffic and types of mobility can we expect? These are the kind of things that this map actually reveals. Same with when something goes wrong with your automated vehicle. What are the specs for troubleshooting? What are the implications for justice and law? What kind of new jobs might emerge from these evolutions? And so on and so on, including it to a wider scale, how these evolutions might influence the politics of energy productions in a country, like in that case in Switzerland, a country in which direct democracy exists with referendums. So here we kind of reveal what are the arguments of the energy lobbies for an upcoming fictional referendum. So this map of Geneva is not optimistic or pessimistic because design fiction is a way to balance optimism with pragmatism, but also critiques from multiple perspectives. So we typically adopt a work ratio of 70-20-10 that kind of encourages this balance. So the majority of the content focuses actually on a more desirable outcomes. There's a small amount that focuses on open questions, and we leave a tiny bit and some aspect of that work to create critical viewpoints. But altogether, they aim at triggering kind of what we call reasonable disagreements. And this kind of map plays the role of a creative contrarian. Because the creative contrarians are necessary because people tend to view the future through their own particular lenses. And as the designer and urbanist Dan Hill said once, if you put traffic engineers in charge of the street, you get traffic. And if you put gardeners in charge of the street, we would get gardens. So this type of design fiction kind of encourages to have different stakeholders of the mobility in a city to challenge each other's assumptions and biases. And it integrates risks and consequences into certain choices. And here, in the case of this map, the annotations and the big 9 that was handwritten in the middle of the map is it shows that this design fiction played its role eventually. And finally, these objects, these fictions from the future are meant to travel in the present outside of the meeting rooms and museum walls. And so what we try to provoke with this kind of work are different kind of reactions. First, you might get a wait, what reaction. Then you might get a okay, but so what? And finally, you might reach a moment when somebody says, I see, but now what? And that's when a person's get to a moment of opening up and being ready for actions. So I started this presentation mentioning how Silicon Valley strongly influences the narrative about the future in organizations with its mantras around acceleration and disruption. And so we believe that design fictions, it offers the kind of space to pre-visualize risk and consequences of these mantras. And we believe this is important, especially with current times. It's also an alternative to working on futures based on interpretation of future projections and data and biases. But however, there's one thing that Silicon Valley and California in general does very well. It is how to make things fun and rigorous in the same times. And this is what design fiction is also all about. And so from my experience, fun and rigor are the best way to engage most of us into discovering and discussing common futures. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fabien. Thanks for joining us here today for the day. And we have now our local hero, Elisabet Roselló. She's the head of Postfuturear, which is a prospective agency based in Barcelona. She has studied trends and advises organizations to think scenarios, and she is our mistress of uncertainty as a space of possibility. Thank you for joining us for this second lesson on the future, Elisabet.
Thank you, Joel, for inviting me. I will try to be really quick on giving some ideas that will connect with Fabien's speech and also with, after me, Scott. I think that we are in a, I don't want to sound cynic, but interesting moment, because after this health crisis has begun, our plausibility sense, or our capacity to think beyond our current beliefs has broadened a little bit. But let's figure out some things, no? There are a lot of challenges to deal with future, what we used to call future. One of them is our relationships of how we understand the world runs, the world is the description we use. By one hand, and I will use also experience that we have been catching all these last years with Postfuturear, and also learning from other colleagues. And one of the things is that, by one hand, there is a thing, maybe you have heard about Mark Fisher, who is a really interesting thinker. One of his theories is that there is something that we call capitalist realism, which it says that it's really difficult for us to think that there is no another alternative, like Margaret Thatcher said a lot of time ago, to think society is really different from capitalism, no? That there cannot be another alternative viable that could work in a future or in another space on the world. So here is a huge challenge. When for example, we run different workshops or work with our clients, they have a really hard time to imagine something that is not capitalistic, like it's something heretical, like something taboo. Another really huge challenge is related with what we think is the future and the time. In fact, we don't have a clue what the hell is time. In physics, for example, they don't have a clue what is time or how it works, and also happens that in philosophy. But we used to think the time like something linear. Maybe you remember that scene in Back to the Future 2 when Doc draws this line, and you are here, that's the present, that's the past, and we tend to think about the future like that. But that's a huge problem, because when we think about the future, we think that it's something that is predetermined by, or teleological, by the universe itself or whatever is our beliefs. So the idea here used to be to try to figure out how the world works, no? How the world is configured, and determine what are more or less the equations, no? Like the formulas to describe it, in order to guess, to predict how will be the future. But the fact is that we don't have a clue how the world works. There are a lot of uncertainties, and always there will be, because it's really complex and it's undeterministic. That, of course, is something that we can explain with more time, because we have a little small time, but that's the idea. And for example, in future studies or social sciences, that idea of the future as only possible scenario is really obsolete. We use, for example, the famous future cone. We are like obsessed. Scott also knows that. But it's a good idea to enter on that concept, that the future, at least a really pragmatic way to engage with it, is like there is an horizon of possibilities. And I say that is an interesting moment now because in these last 6 months, we have opened our mind that really weird stuff can happen. In fact, there is a meme, no? Like, oh, this is so 2020. Oh, a hurricane now in the Mediterranean Sea. Oh, this is so 2020. A locust plague. This is so 2020. Okay, 2020. What do you have for us? Come to us. So. We are more open, but at the same time, our relationship with the future and the time, it is not changing at a really nice rhythm. So my point is that, yes, it's really important also to figure out possible scenarios where we want to go as a society and also as organizations. That is really interesting exercise. And it's really important because it helps us to make decisions, to know what we want, but at the same time we have to have a knowledge, however the uncertainties, where we are. So we need a new relationship with the complexity and not to try to hide it like, hey, there is no complexity, or everything is simple. No, everything is complex, or a lot of things are complex or complicated. And a new relationship with the future. So this is my advices for this small session of future. And I hope that it inspires you.
Thank you so much, Elisabet. That was super sweet and to the point, and maybe we have time to go into it a bit later. And our third guest today and our third lesson about the future is by Scott Smith, who is one of the founding partners of Changeist, foresight and future design organization who has worked with multiple big organizations from the BBC to the New York Times. And I am super happy to have them here because after many years of developing a very important and relevant line of work, they have a book out this September called How to Future. Scott, it sort of felt it was like a good year to release a book called How to Future. So that's what happens when you know how the future is going to be like. You can take that decision. So thank you so much for being here. And also, Scott personally crossed half of Europe to be here with us today on a car to join us, which is not something that we really do a lot of in 2020. So him speaking today here has been a whole journey and travel. So thank you, Scott.
Thank you, José Luis, and thank you to Sonar for the invitation and for the courage to commit to doing this event and to doing it, and it's such an amazing job. And it's a pleasure to be on the stage with two of my most favorite colleagues, and they've covered a tremendous amount of information. So I guess what I want to sort of do is maybe step back a little bit and take a kind of broader perspective, a bit more of a historical, critical perspective to see where we're going. And when I first saw the title of the talk, or the title of the session, So What About the Future? You know, we could just take the comma out of the English piece and say, well, so what about the future at this point? Because all of our efforts and all of our hard professional work kind of brings us back to where we are right now. So in 2016 was the last time that I gave a talk in Barcelona. And as part of this talk, it was in a kind of digital advertising, sort of media-focused event here in the city. And I dropped this slide into the middle of it to kind of give a counterpoint to a lot of the discourse in the event. And at the end, you know, someone came up to me and said, oh, Scott, why so grim? And I said, well, first of all, you know me, right? And second of all, you know, it's 2016. Like, wow, how much worse can it get? You know, this is kind of where we are. The principal constant is uncertainty. So to be fair, at the end of that presentation, it wasn't all that. There was a kind of human hand at the end that opened up, and there's a message inside that says, this machine makes futures. So hold that thought for a minute. So my degree, as I often kind of bore people with, is in history, not futures. But it's an effective way to sort of to examine what we know and where did we get the tools and the kind of frameworks that we operate from. And as a good critical futurist, I think it's really important to step back and to kind of see the whole picture, to understand what we've inherited and what is in the DNA of the way that we think about the future. So over the past few decades, we've learned where a lot of our products come from, and it's useful to have a sense of where our collective societal futures come from as well, to understand where we might be going. The consideration, as you might say, the colonization of the future space as we think about it in the modern sense, started in the early post-war days, when people realized, and the people in power at that time, in the kind of post-war, immediate post-war moment, understood what they had just achieved, not only the sort of the temporary extinguishing of fascism in parts of the world, but also the kind of the creation of the ability to end everything all at once, the sort of existential threat of a nuclear weapon. And that set a lot of people to thinking, bureaucrats and people in government and philosophers, and in the US, primarily a group of very smart people sitting inside what was then becoming the military-industrial complex. So you had the formation of these entities like the RAND Corporation, a think tank sitting in Santa Monica, California, that was formed effectively to try to deal with this mess of all of these pieces that were left over after the war. And in particular, to deal with something that we were starting to talk about then called society. The concept of society in the same way didn't necessarily exist in the pre-war construct, but here suddenly we had sort of the wiping clean and establishment of new forms of government, and we had society to deal with across the world, but in particular in the US, and the kind of people demobilizing from the military and new people coming into society. So ironically, their brief in the groups like this was to determine both defense and social policy at the same time, and to stop and think about that idea for a moment. But their way of approaching it was to take a new tool, the electronic computer, and to use computational approaches to simulating what society could be like, and to try to establish a quantitative relationship between all of the factors that Elisabet just referred to. Like, the world is complex, and we have a very, very difficult, if not impossible, time drawing the relationships between these things. But if you could simulate it, you could predict it, was the idea. So, with very strong math and very weak vacuum tubes as the tools to hand, and the future is an equation to be solved. And this gave us the kind of command and control future. So while they laid the foundation for a lot of the methods that we've inherited as younger professionals here at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century, they mistook the simulation for the territory. And that was kind of the fatal flaw in the work that they did. So the next up in this parade of future shapers are corporations. By providing us with a kind of all-encompassing view of what the future might be, showing us our home of the future, our kitchen of the future, our automobile of the future, our city of the future, all of these efforts basically create a kind of solvent that dissolve our agency as individuals by positioning us as Elisabet said, as consumers of this future. It gives us a sort of easy option to choose something that's flat packed, to take it off the shelf like the IKEA catalog that Fabien showed. And by presenting the future as flat packed, the choice becomes very, very easy for us. But this is where future consultants come into the picture. In the 1970s and 1980s, working with the captains of industry to chart a rosy future, we have this kind of growth mentality and long boom mentality. And those of you old enough to remember this Wired magazine issue from 1999, this was, this idea, and the book behind it was given to us by one of the sort of developers of modern scenario planning, Peter Schwartz. If you find the essay, which you can find online for the long boom, it was telling us that we were about to enter decades of unmitigated, unbroken peace and prosperity worldwide. This was about, I think, 16 months before 9/11. We put that in the kind of the file, but along the way, what they mistook was the product roadmap for the territory. But next we come to technologists. And for the most of our adult lives, technologists have been defining what we see or what we accept as the future with a capital F. New frontiers of development, connecting the world, removing all friction from our daily routine, turning flat models of behaviors and ethics into products. They make futures on an exponential scale for us. They leave the planet and take those futures elsewhere. Even the wealthiest people who are engaging this are engaging in a form of world building on our behalf and presenting to us wholly constructed futures for us to accept. But here, the technologists have mistaken Moore's law for the territory. So the latest group, and here we are in the midst of this kind of, this wave of development, the latest group that we work with are the designers. Imagining and creating and looking for new frontiers to bring to us. Some have encountered the future as the ultimate product or service that they can design. So unlike perhaps the kind of cynicism and self-interest that were in the previous groups, this cohort broadly works from a basis of altruism, that using the tools and skills and intelligence they have to make things better for all of us, to be a catalyst or an enabler or the point of delivery of that creation. But we heard earlier about something like the Futures Cone. A decade ago, you probably would have had to dig quite deeply to find what that was. It was also a construct or a diagram that came out of military scenario planning and strategy. But now if you put Futures Cone into Google Images, you will find page after page after page of this same model modified and duplicated as a sort of product of its own. So I think this focus too much perhaps on tools and process is drawing us towards a future that becomes instrumentalized, that is seeing it as a kind of output of an industrial design product or process is taking us into a direction where we mistake the methodology or the diagram for the territory. So who's left? Well, look around. You're the last one standing. So it's this idea that basically the most important thing we can do right now is to take the future in our own hands. And by that, I'm taking myself out of my professional role as a futurist and looking at this as an individual, as a member of my community, as a member of my society. to not necessarily ask people to become world-class experts and domain leaders and thought leaders, digesting and citing and applying the literature and all of the processes that you can find, but to do simple things like learning to change our focal length, to think about how we can see in the world around us right now those broken futures, those building blocks that we can create from, and to be able to speak to each other about the futures that we see and articulate what those may look like, and to have some level of self-determination. And this is at the level of individuals, of groups, of organization and society, and not letting expertise or virtuosity kind of become a barrier to engaging with the future ourselves at a basic level on a daily basis. So it takes a future to fight a future. If you don't like the one that you see, you have the responsibility to learn how to future yourself. That's how we actually move something in this process. And given the news that many of us woke up to this morning about Justice Ginsburg passing in the US, the responsibility, I think, is on us. This phrase from James Baldwin, I think, has never been really truer. The challenge is in the moment, and the time to future is now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I mean, amazing in a conversation about time. We have time left, which I didn't really expect. And we have a lot of questions, but I have a first one. And to me, it can take a lot of time to answer this one, but it would be very helpful if the three of you give me a short impression. The main way of engaging with the future in society is through expert prediction. We know that expert prediction is a very faulty methodology. How do we create a social conscience around that, and what do we replace it with? Who wants to have
anyone? I mean, I think it's quite important to kind of get that idea across, that there's an obsession with the idea of exactitude and using, I mean, I just kind of gave those examples of the many tools that we try to bring to bear to identify the future, when really what we're trying to find is the range of possibility, and to identify what we don't know, rather than to pinpoint what we're absolutely certain about. And to find to use the Rumsfeld phrase of the unknown unknowns and the known unknowns. We need to be able to shrink the field of things that we're uncertain about and find out why we don't have certainty about them.
Yeah, no, I agree, but with that, but also there is another layer with the prediction, no? Related with what we were talking about how we see the future is only a possible scenario, and you have to guess. You have to, I don't know, throwing the tarot cards, no. But like the predictions, even with big data, is like the new tarot cards. We expect that they explain to us how to engage with that, and we need another way to think. For example, we are promoting to overpass the idea of future, and being in a continuous present, in a presentism. That's an idea from my colleague Albano Cruz. So maybe better than thinking about the future is thinking how we can make things from now, knowing what is changing, and there are a lot of uncertainties at the same time. So I don't know what more to explain. Is predictions are bullshit. And that's it.
Bullet point. Cosine.
And I have a question for Fabien. The natural medium of foresight for a lot of time was basically the report, was the analysis. But you belong to a school of designers who engage with the future through the object, the artifact. After 10 years of working in that medium, in design fiction, which mostly produces it, do you have a sense of what can the artifact do that the analysis or the report cannot do? But also, what are its limitations? What is it good for, and what is it not so good for?
So just also to a brief answer to the previous question, I think we all have to be comfortable now of being able, of not knowing what will happen. So I think that's one part of the key. Like, not knowing is also part of the thing that we have to be comfortable with. And the question about design fiction, I think my argument is that I think that the power of object is that they are accessible and people can relate to, and I think that's a very different way of kind of experiences what might come when you can actually touch it, moving around, and sharing and discuss around it, like discussing around a totem with an object that everybody can understand all together. And I think the limitations of what we do is the main one is that when you produce an object, it's often hard to explain where things come from. And so it has to come with the kind of subtitles of why there is a provocations here. Why do we talk about the future of energy in that way or another way? So eventually, these objects that we produce, they always have to come with an explanation. And if there's no explanation, then you might be open to kind of misinterpretation of what we're trying to produce, which is kind of I think the main limitations of using ideas in fiction is that people not getting the kind of the hidden messages that are all spread around these objects.
There's a question for Scott, actually. It connects very well with your idea that we are all futurists now. Because the implication is if we are all futurists now, the same way that we are all TV stars now, or that at least we are all doing TV, hello, but also us in our Instagram rooms at home, in our Zoom calls, being futurists or recognizing that we are all futurists now would also mean that there is some role in everyday life and in your everyday life decisions for the tools and the methodologies of foresight, which is the discipline that tries to deal with futures. So that's the question for everyday common situations. What does foresight have to tell us?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things we write about in the book is this idea of kind of taking these actions or these kind of behaviors and making them embodied rather than separate methodologies that live over there in foresight. So active sensing, being aware of what's happening around you in the world, and not being afraid to kind of absorb and collect that information so it becomes signals that you can build up to understand emerging patterns over time. That's something that we can do outside of the construct of foresight. And things like being able to not just tell a story to someone else about the future that you prefer, but also being able to describe the implications and the impacts of that, the risks and liabilities and opportunities that emerge from that. All of those things are behaviors that we can do on a daily basis, walking around, and not just when we've stepped into a meeting room or have a flip chart or a Post-it note in our hand. So I think the idea of going from a business to a behavior is really critical for how we approach foresight.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, Fabien, Scott, and Elisabet, for joining us in this session. It's been a really great contextualization of what we wanted to really learn more about, which is how to deal with this difficult and ever more important cultural object that we used to call the future. Y sigue Sónar+D hoy y sigue las actividades por el resto del día.